Hey, everyone. Today I want to share a story about a girl named Emma. Her parents divorced when she was in her early teens, and her mom quickly remarried. Emma's life turned upside down. As soon as she turned 16, Emma married to escape the cage she felt trapped in. But she soon realized she was in an even worse situation. The story delves into her internal struggles, her grief, her tangled emotions toward both David and his son Michael, and her journey to reclaim her voice amidst abuse and manipulation. The chapters follow her descent into darkness, brief moments of hope, and the philosophical introspection that colors her journey from victim to a fighter for her life and sanity. Chapter 1. The Silent Cage. Emma stared out the narrow window of her bedroom, her gaze fixed on the world beyond the glass, a world that felt so distant and unreachable. Outside, children ran across the street, their laughter rising like an echo of a life she once knew. At 15, she had long stopped believing in such simple joys. Her life was different now, a slow, suffocating existence in a house that no longer felt like home. She could hear her mother and stepfather arguing downstairs, their voices a low rumble, growing louder with each exchange. Emma had learned to tune them out, just as she had learned to keep her own voice silent. The walls of this house were thick, but not thick enough to muffle the weight of her stepfather's anger or the passive resignation in her mother's responses. Emma had become an expert in silence. Her silence, their silence, the silence of a life that had become nothing but routine, survival. Her stepfather, Greg, wasn't the worst kind of monster, but he was a constant shadow, one that pressed down on her every moment of the day. He was never outright violent, but his presence was suffocating. His voice was heavy with condescension, his gaze lingering too long on her. He never hit her, but his mere existence was enough to fill her with dread, his words cutting deeper than any blow ever could. Her mother, once vibrant and full of life, had faded like an old photograph. In the beginning, Emma had hoped her mom would fight for her, would stand up to Greg, protect her from the growing unease that had settled in the house. But over time, her mother had surrendered, retreating into a shell of herself. Emma had watched as her mother chose silence, time and time again, each choice reinforcing the cage they now shared. Emma's fingers traced the windowsill, feeling the cold paint beneath her skin. Outside was freedom, a place where the air didn't feel so thick, where she could breathe without the weight of Greg's presence hovering over her. But inside this house, she was trapped, her life reduced to nothing more than a series of endless days that blurred into each other with no clear future in sight. Her only solace came in the rare moments when Greg was away, when the house was quiet and still. In those moments, Emma would dream of escape, of finding a way out. But those dreams were fleeting, swallowed up by the reality of her situation. Where could she go? Who would help her? Even if she could leave, what was waiting for her out there? A sudden slam of a door downstairs jolted her back to the present. The voices grew louder, her mother's tone pleading now, while Greg's response was sharp, cutting through the house like a knife. Emma closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the panic that came whenever their arguments escalated. She had learned to stay out of sight when things got bad. Invisibility was her only defense. If Greg couldn't see her, then he couldn't direct his anger toward her. But that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Didn't stop the sickening feeling that something terrible was always just around the corner. Suddenly, the argument stopped, the silence even more unnerving than the shouting. Emma held her breath, waiting, listening for the next sound. She heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, the familiar creak of the second step under Greg's weight. Her heart raced, her fingers clenching into tight fists. The door to her room opened slowly, and there stood Greg, his frame filling the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. "Dinner's ready," he said, his voice void of any warmth. Emma nodded but didn't move. She watched as Greg lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, as if he was daring her to speak, to defy him. But she didn't. She stayed silent, just as she always did. After a moment, he turned and walked away, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand. She knew better than to delay when Greg called. In this house, obedience was survival. As she descended the stairs, she passed by the family photos that lined the hallway. Pictures from a time when her mother used to smile, back when Emma's world was still bright and full of promise. Now, the smiles in those photos felt like cruel reminders of what had been lost. The dining room was dimly lit, the table set with the same bland routine of their lives. Her mother was already seated, eyes downcast, hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the napkin on her lap. Greg sat at the head of the table, his presence dominating the room, as always. Emma sat down, the chair creaking under her as she pulled it closer to the table. She glanced at her mother, hoping for some sign of strength, some silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. But her mother's eyes remained fixed on the table, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The silence during dinner was as oppressive as the air in the house. Greg ate slowly, methodically, as if he was in complete control of every moment, every bite. Emma forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like ash in her mouth. When dinner was over, Greg stood up and without a word left the room. The moment he was gone, Emma felt the tension in her body release, the knot in her stomach easing slightly. Her mother stayed seated for a while, staring at her half-empty plate before finally rising to clear the table. Emma stood to help, but her mother shook her head. "I'll take care of it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded and turned to leave, her feet carrying her back up the stairs to her room, to the one place where she could be alone with her thoughts. The walls of her bedroom felt like a cage, but it was the only place she could retreat to, the only space that was truly hers. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window again, her mind racing. The world outside continued on, unaware of the silent battle she fought every day. The children were gone now, their laughter replaced by the quiet hum of the night. Emma leaned back, her head resting against the cool wall. She felt trapped, suffocated by the life she had been forced into, by the silence that had become her only means of survival. But somewhere deep inside, there was still a small, flickering hope that one day she would find a way out of this silent cage, a way to escape the life that had been thrust upon her, to reclaim her voice, her freedom. For now, though, she remained silent, waiting, watching, and dreaming of a world beyond the glass. Chapter 2. Stepfather's Shadows. The sun had begun to set, casting long, creeping shadows across the walls of the house as Emma sat in the corner of her room, her knees pulled up to her chest. The room felt smaller than ever, the shadows dancing like dark phantoms along the floor. She knew Greg was home. His heavy footsteps had echoed through the hallway just minutes ago, a sound that always made her heart tighten with fear. Greg had come into her life like a storm, sudden and overwhelming. When he first appeared, Emma was just 12, still reeling from her parents' divorce, unsure of the world that had become so unstable overnight. Her mother had fallen for Greg quickly, too quickly, and before Emma had time to understand what was happening, he had moved into their house, taking up space like an intruder she couldn't get rid of. Greg wasn't loud. Not in the way Emma expected a cruel man to be. He was quiet, cold. His anger always just beneath the surface, simmering like a pot ready to boil over at any moment. But it wasn't the shouting that hurt the most. It was the constant tension, the way he lingered in doorways, watching, waiting for an excuse to exercise control. She heard the faint creak of the stairs and held her breath. The steps were slow and deliberate, the kind that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Greg was coming up the stairs again, probably looking for something or someone. Her heart raced in time with his steps, each one louder in her mind, echoing in the silence of the house. Emma's bedroom door was closed, but she knew better than to assume that would keep him out. He never knocked. The invasion of her space was a power he enjoyed wielding, as if reminding her that nothing in this house truly belonged to her, not even the air she breathed. She had tried locking the door once, but that ended with Greg breaking it open, splintering the wood as if it was nothing. The next morning, the lock had been removed completely. The door creaked open, the shadow of Greg filling the threshold. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his eyes sweeping over the room before settling on her in the corner. Emma didn't meet his gaze. She kept her eyes on the floor, her body instinctively curling tighter, as if she could make herself smaller, less visible. "Your mom's not home," he said, his voice flat, void of warmth. "She went to run errands. Just us for a while." Emma nodded, though she didn't look up. She hated being alone with him, hated the way his presence made the air feel thick and heavy. Greg took a step into the room, and though he didn't come any closer, the invasion of her space was palpable. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to break. "I don't know why you hide up here all the time," he said, his voice still eerily calm. "This is your home. You should come downstairs. Be a part of the family." Family. The word felt like poison on his lips. Emma's real family had dissolved long ago, scattered in the aftermath of the divorce. Her father had moved to a different state, too far away to be of any real support. Her mother had latched onto Greg as if he were a lifeline, ignoring all the signs, the cracks that had been there from the start. "I'm fine here," Emma mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Fine, huh? You don't seem fine to me. You seem distant, like you don't want to be here." Emma didn't answer. She knew better than to engage. Greg thrived on conflict, on pushing people until they snapped, so he could swoop in and remind them who held the power. After a moment of silence, he sighed dramatically, turning as if to leave. But just before he stepped out of the room, he paused, his hand still on the door frame. "You know," he said, not looking back at her, "I've been very patient with you, Emma. I've given you time to adjust, to get used to this new life. But you're not a little girl anymore. It's time you start acting like a part of this family." His words were laced with a threat, subtle but unmistakable. Emma's skin crawled. She wanted to scream, to tell him she would never be part of anything he was a part of, but she swallowed the words. Speaking up only made things worse. Greg left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Emma sat there, frozen, the tension in her body so tight it hurt. She stared at the spot where he had stood, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the constant fear she lived in, the feeling that she was always being watched, always one wrong move away from disaster. For Greg's shadows followed her everywhere in this house, his voice, his footsteps, his controlling presence. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, mental, a weight pressing down on her soul every day. She never felt safe, not even in her own room. The silence of the house had once been a comfort, but now it was oppressive, a reminder that she had no way out. In the darkness of her room, Emma closed her eyes and tried to imagine a different life. One where her father had stayed, where her mother hadn't fallen into the arms of a man like Greg. One where she was free to be a teenager, to have dreams, friends, laughter, anything but this suffocating existence. But the fantasy faded as quickly as it came. The reality of Greg's presence was all too real, too constant. His shadows loomed large, reminding her that no matter how much she dreamed of escape, she was trapped. For now. Emma pulled her blanket tighter around her, not for warmth, but for comfort. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. Tears felt pointless in a place like this. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds, waiting for the darkness to settle completely so she could disappear into sleep, the only place where Greg couldn't follow her. But even in sleep, his shadows lingered. Chapter 3. Glimmers of Hope. The days in the house with Greg were an endless loop of tension and silence, punctuated by moments of cold, simmering dread. Emma often felt like a ghost, moving through her life unnoticed, unseen, and unheard. But every now and then, something small, just a flicker, would stir in her, a faint glimmer of hope, reminding her that she hadn't completely disappeared into the shadows of this suffocating existence. It was on a Saturday afternoon that one of those glimmers appeared, when Emma's mother, Sarah, seemed more like the person she used to be. They were in the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. The soft hum of the kettle was the only sound, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Greg was out, running some errand that Emma didn't care about. The house was quiet, not the oppressive kind of quiet that usually loomed over them, but a peaceful stillness, almost fragile. Emma glanced at her mother as she moved about the kitchen, her hands busy with something mundane, folding towels, rearranging things in the cabinet. There was a tiredness in her mother's movements, but for the first time in months, maybe even years, there was also a strange lightness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Emma pause, wondering if this was just another fleeting moment or something more. "You know," her mother said suddenly, breaking the silence, "when you were younger, you used to help me with baking on weekends." Emma looked up, surprised to hear her mother's voice so normal. "Yeah, I remember," she said softly. Her mother smiled, a small, sad smile, as though the memory brought both warmth and pain. "You used to get flour everywhere. The kitchen would be a mess by the end of it, but you were always so proud when we pulled the cookies out of the oven." Emma nodded, her throat tightening at the memory. That had been before Greg, before everything had gone wrong, when it was just the two of them. There was love back then. Laughter, too. Now it felt like a different lifetime. "We could do that again," Emma said cautiously, her words tentative. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe it was just desperation to feel close to her mother again, to have even a brief connection that wasn't smothered by Greg's presence. Her mother looked at her, her eyes softening, as if the suggestion had caught her off guard. For a moment, Emma thought she saw something break through the fog that had settled over her mother since Greg had come into their lives. "Maybe we could," she said quietly, though the words were filled with uncertainty. There was a long silence after that, and Emma didn't push any further. But even the small hint of possibility, the idea that they might bake together, even if just for an hour, felt like something to hold on to, something to pull her through the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer, and in a life where hope had become a rare thing, even the smallest bit was precious. Later that afternoon, while her mother napped on the couch, Emma found herself wandering into the backyard. It wasn't large, just a small patch of grass, a few overgrown bushes, and an old weathered bench that had been there for as long as she could remember. It had been a long time since she'd come out here. Greg didn't care much for the yard, so it had become one of the few places that still felt like hers, untouched by his influence. She sat down on the bench, the wood creaking under her weight, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool autumn breeze wash over her. Out here, she could almost pretend she was somewhere else, somewhere far away from Greg, from the house, from everything that weighed her down. Emma opened her eyes and stared at the sky, a pale blue with wisps of clouds drifting lazily across it. She imagined what it would be like to just walk away, to keep walking until she was free. But then reality would creep back in. The weight of her situation, the knowledge that There was nowhere to go. At 15, running away wasn't really an option. And even if it was, where would she run to? Still, sitting out here, with the fresh air on her face and the quiet whisper of the wind in her ears, she felt just a little lighter. She hadn't felt that way in a long time. It wasn't freedom, but it was something close to it, a brief escape from the prison her home had become. As she sat there, Emma thought about school. It was the only place where she could be around people of her age, where she didn't have to constantly look over her shoulder for Greg's shadow. She wasn't close with anyone. She kept to herself, too scared to let anyone see the cracks in her life. But there was comfort in the routine. At school, she could pretend, if only for a few hours, that she was just another teenager, that her life wasn't falling apart at the seams. Look, there was one teacher, Mr. Green, who had noticed her silence. He hadn't asked her any direct questions, but he'd given her a few quiet moments of kindness, an extra book to read, a soft word of encouragement after class. He didn't push her to speak, didn't pry into her life, and for that she was grateful. It was another glimmer, another small spark in the darkness that surrounded her. Emma stood up from the bench, brushing her hands over her jeans. She knew this moment wouldn't last, knew that Greg would be home soon, and the weight of his presence would settle over the house once more. But for now, for these brief moments in the backyard, she could breathe. Maybe that's what hope was, she thought. Not a grand escape, not a sweeping change that would fix everything, but small moments, quiet ones, where the weight lifted just enough for her to feel like she could survive another day. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. As she made her way back inside, she heard her mother stirring on the couch, waking from her nap. Emma hesitated in the doorway for a moment, wondering if her mother would remember the suggestion they had talked about earlier, the idea of baking together, of doing something that felt normal, like it used to be. "Mom," she called softly, her voice tentative, "do you still want to bake later? We could make those cookies." Her mother looked up, her face still groggy from sleep. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like recognition, like she was remembering what it was like to be the mother Emma needed. For a moment it seemed like she might say yes, that they could reclaim just a little bit of the life they'd lost. But then the door opened, and Greg's heavy footsteps echoed through the house, filling the space with tension once again. The flicker in her mother's eyes disappeared, replaced by the same dull, lifeless expression Emma had grown used to. "Maybe another time," her mother whispered, standing up to greet Greg as if nothing had ever changed. Emma's heart sank, but she didn't let the disappointment crush her. Instead, she held on to the glimmer she had found earlier, the fresh air, the sky, the brief moment of hope. It was small, but it was hers. And for now, that was enough to keep going. Chapter 4. The Proposal of Escape. Emma sat on her bed, staring at the soft glow of her phone screen in the dim light of her room. She had read the message 3 times, but it still didn't feel real. "I can help you. We can figure it out together." It was from Liam, her best friend, the one person who had seen through her silence. They had met at school a year ago, and even though Emma never shared much about her home life, Liam had sensed that something was wrong. He didn't pry, didn't ask too many questions, but he was always there. A quiet presence, offering her support in a way that no one else did. And now he had sent this message, a lifeline disguised as a few simple words. Emma's heart raced as she typed back, "What do you mean?" Her fingers trembled, her body filled with a mix of fear and something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. Seconds felt like hours before her phone buzzed again. "I've been thinking about it for a while. You don't have to stay there. You shouldn't. We can get out of this place, Em. There's a way. We just have to be smart about it." She swallowed hard, staring at the screen. Could it really be that simple? Could she just leave? The idea felt both thrilling and terrifying. Leaving meant abandoning everything. Her mother, the only life she had ever known. The chains that had kept her bound to this house, to Greg and his suffocating control. But staying meant more years of silent suffering, more days of walking on eggshells, hoping Greg wouldn't turn his temper toward her. Emma shifted on the bed, her mind spinning. The thought of escape had crossed her mind countless times before, but it had always felt impossible. She was just 16, with no real way to support herself, no safety net. And her mother, how could she leave her mother behind? As broken and distant as their relationship had become, the idea of abandoning her felt wrong, like betrayal. Yet Emma knew her mother would never leave Greg. She was too far gone, too entrenched in the lies he spun, the life he controlled. She stared out the window, the same view she had seen for years, the same life that stretched on endlessly before her. Emma had spent so many nights in that bed, dreaming of running away, but the fear of the unknown had always held her back. Now the possibility was here, right in front of her. Liam, offering her a chance to break free, to leave everything behind. But could she actually do it? The phone buzzed again. "I've got some money saved up. It's not a lot, but we can get by. We can go somewhere far away from here. Start over. Start over." The words echoed in Emma's mind, filling her with a sense of longing she hadn't realized had been buried so deep. A fresh start. No more Greg, no more silent dinners, no more living in fear of what might happen next. She imagined waking up in a place where she didn't have to constantly look over her shoulder, where she didn't feel trapped by invisible bars. But there were so many questions. "Where would we go?" she typed, her thoughts swirling. "I have an uncle upstate," Liam replied. "He runs a small farm. He's cool, doesn't ask questions. We could stay with him for a while, figure out what to do next. It's not forever, but it's a way out." A way out. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as the weight of the offer settled on her. She imagined the farm, fields of open land, far from the suffocating presence of Greg, far from the house where the walls seemed to close in on her more each day. She imagined walking away from it all, leaving this life behind and starting fresh with Liam, someone who cared about her, someone who saw her. It felt so close, like she could reach out and touch it. But then her mind went to her mother again, the ghost of a woman who still lived in the same house, but was no longer the person Emma remembered. Could she leave her mother to face Greg alone? Even though Sarah had become distant, she was still Emma's mother. There was a time long ago when she had been Emma's world. Could Emma really abandon her, knowing she'd never come back? "What about my mom?" she typed. Her chest tightened as she hit send, fearing what Liam's answer might be. The reply came quickly. "I know it's hard, but she's made her choice, Emma. You can't save her. She's too deep in, but you can save yourself. You deserve better than this. You don't have to stay in a place that's destroying you." Emma's eyes stung with the weight of his words. Deep down, she knew he was right. Her mother had made her choice the day she allowed Greg to take over their lives. Every time she looked the other way, every time she stayed silent, she had chosen Greg. Emma couldn't force her mother to leave, couldn't pull her out of the darkness if she didn't want to go. But Emma, she could still escape. She could still choose herself. Her phone buzzed again, and she read the message that followed. "I'll be at the park tomorrow after school. If you're ready, meet me there. We'll leave right away." The park. It was their place, the one spot where Emma and Liam had shared their quiet talks, sitting on the swings long after the sun had set, when the rest of the world felt far away. It was fitting that this moment, the moment she might leave everything behind, would start there. Emma stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. Was she really ready to do this? Could she walk away, not just from Greg and the house, but from her mother and the life she had known? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, heavier than anything she had ever felt. But mixed in with that weight was something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She typed back quickly, her fingers moving almost of their own accord. I'll be there. And just like that, the decision was made. Emma closed her eyes and let the breath she hadn't realized she was holding out slowly. Tomorrow. Tomorrow everything could change. That night, Emma packed a small bag, stuffing it with the few things that mattered most to her. Her sketchbook, a couple of clothes, and a necklace her father had given her before he left. She stood by the window again, staring out into the darkness, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. Tomorrow she would meet Liam, and they would leave. Tomorrow she would begin the life she had only dreamed of. As she lay down to sleep, her thoughts raced. Could she really leave? Would Greg find out? Would her mother understand? Or would she hate her for it? But as her eyes fluttered shut, Emma reminded herself of one thing. No matter what happened, this was her choice. For the first time in her life, she had the power to choose her future, and that, more than anything, gave her the strength to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The glimmer of hope had become a spark, and now it was ready to ignite. Chapter 5. Sold for Freedom. The next day, as Emma walked through the school hallways, the world around her seemed distant, like she was watching everything through a foggy window. Her decision weighed heavily on her, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. She had never been so sure about anything in her life. She was leaving. Today, everything would change. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and Emma quickly packed her things, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She kept her head down, feeling like the weight of her secret would be too much to hide if anyone looked too closely. Her heart pounded with each step as she made her way toward the park. The familiar path was now laced with anxiety and anticipation. The knowledge that she was about to leave this life behind, making her chest tighten with both fear and excitement. When she reached the park, Liam was already there, sitting on one of the swings. His face lit up with a small, reassuring smile when he saw her. He stood up as she approached, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, trying to appear calm, but Emma could see the same nervous energy mirrored in his eyes. "You came," he said softly, his voice full of relief. Emma nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She didn't trust herself to say anything yet. The enormity of what she was about to do was finally hitting her in full force, but there was no turning back now. Liam looked at her small duffel bag. "That's all you're bringing?" Emma nodded again. "I don't have much that I want to keep from there." He gave her a sad, understanding smile and motioned toward the path leading out of the park. "It's all set. I talked to my uncle. He's expecting us tonight. We'll take the bus to the station and then a train out of town. No one will even know we're gone until we're long away." Emma glanced back toward the direction of her house, a part of her still tethered to the life she was about to leave behind. Images of her mother flashed in her mind, her tired eyes, her hollow smile, the way she had once been, and the way Greg had slowly erased her. A small voice inside her whispered that she should stay, that she could save her mother if she just tried harder. But another voice, the stronger one, reminded her that she had tried over and over again, and her mother had chosen her cage. Taking a deep breath, Emma turned back to Liam. "Let's go." They walked in silence to the bus stop, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as the late afternoon light cast long shadows over the streets. The town seemed quieter than usual, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Emma's heart raced with every step. She kept expecting to hear Greg's voice behind her, to feel his hand grab her shoulder, dragging her back to the nightmare she was leaving. But the streets remained empty. No one was coming after her. For the first time in years, she felt something like freedom creeping into the edges of her mind. When they reached the bus stop, they sat on the bench, waiting for the bus that would take them to the station. Emma's hands fidgeted in her lap, twisting the strap of her bag nervously. Liam was calm beside her, though she could sense the tension in his silence. After a few minutes, he spoke quietly. "You're really doing this, Emma. You're getting out." She nodded, biting her lip. "Yeah, I am." Liam reached over and squeezed her hand. "You deserve better than what you've been through. You deserve to be free." Free? The word hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with meaning. Emma wanted to believe it, but there was still a part of her that felt like this was all too good to be true, like something was going to go wrong at any moment. Nothing had ever come easy in her life, and freedom, true freedom, felt like a distant dream, something she wasn't sure she could ever truly grasp. The bus pulled up to the stop, and they climbed on, finding seats in the back. As the bus pulled away, Emma looked out the window, watching the familiar streets of her town blur past. Each mile they traveled felt like another chain breaking away, another step toward the life she so desperately wanted. But just as Emma began to let herself believe that escape was possible, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her pocket, her stomach dropping when she saw the caller ID. Mom. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen. She hadn't told her mother anything about her plan. What if she knew? What if Greg had found out somehow? Emma's mind raced with possibilities, but before she could think, her finger swiped to answer. "Emma?" Her mother's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Where are you?" Emma hesitated, glancing at Liam, who looked at her with concern. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. I'm out." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Emma could hear the tension in her mother's breathing. "You're with Liam, aren't you? You're trying to leave." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "Mom, I can't stay there anymore. I can't live with Greg. I'm suffocating." Her mother's voice broke. "Emma, you can't just leave like this. It's not that simple." "It is for me," Emma whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't do it anymore, Ma. I have to go. You should come with me." There was a long silence, and when her mother spoke again, her voice was hollow, resigned. "I can't, Emma. I can't leave Greg. You know that." Emma felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "Why? Why can't you leave him, Mom? He's destroyed everything. He's destroyed you." "I made my choices," her mother said softly, her voice breaking. "And I have to live with them." Emma bit her lip, the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to shake her mother out of whatever fog Greg had trapped her in, but deep down, she knew it was hopeless. Her mother wasn't coming with her. She had chosen Greg long ago. "I love you, Mom," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't stay. I can't be sold for your freedom anymore." Her mother let out a choked sob. "I love you too, Emma. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." It was... The line went dead, and Emma sat there, her phone still pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. Liam gently took the phone from her and placed it in her lap. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, offering the only comfort he could. The bus rumbled on, carrying them farther away from the life Emma was leaving behind. Her chest ached with the weight of what she had just done, but even through the pain, there was a sense of finality, a sense that for the first time in her life she had made a choice for herself. She had chosen freedom. Chapter 6. A Gilded Prison. Emma stood at the entrance of David's estate, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the sprawling mansion before her. Tall, imposing gates loomed over her, with golden accents gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The manicured lawns, the grand fountains, the marble statues scattered around. It all looked like something from a fairy tale. But as Emma stepped closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the beginning of a beautiful story. This was something else, something much darker. Her stomach churned as the heavy iron gate slowly swung open, a low creak echoing across the empty driveway. This is it, she thought, her heart pounding. This is where my life changes. David had made sure of that. It was only a few days ago that her mother, looking more worn than ever, had sat her down to deliver the news. David Hadley, the wealthy businessman who had recently taken an interest in their lives, had proposed marriage. Not to her mother, but to Emma. "He's offering us security, Emma," her mother had said, her voice shaky but resolute. "You'll never want for anything. You'll be taken care of." Her mother's words still echoed in her mind as she followed a servant up the marble steps of David's home. It was hard to ignore the bitterness in her mouth. Security, being taken care of. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't what she wanted. But the truth was, after everything she had been through, her life with Greg, her mother's abandonment in favor of her stepfather's cruelty, this seemed like the only way out. David was the ticket to escape her past, or at least that's what everyone kept telling her. He was rich, powerful, and could offer her a life far removed from the broken home she had known. But as Emma stepped inside the grand foyer, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors, she couldn't help but feel like she had traded one prison for another. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, and the air smelled faintly of fresh roses. Everything screamed luxury, but it all felt cold, lifeless, like the house itself was an elaborate facade hiding something sinister beneath its perfect exterior. Emma's fingers tightened around the strap of her small bag, the only thing she had brought with her from the life she was leaving behind. Her eyes flicked around the room, searching for David, but instead she was met by silence. "This way, Miss Emma," the servant said, leading her down a long hallway. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by thick carpets as they moved deeper into the mansion. Emma glanced at the ornate doors they passed, wondering what was behind each one, feeling like each closed door was another secret she wasn't meant to uncover. Finally, they stopped at a large set of double doors. The servant pushed them open to reveal a grand sitting room, its walls lined with bookshelves and a massive fireplace crackling in the corner. And there, seated in a high-backed chair near the window, was David. He stood as soon as he saw her, his face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his eye. "Emma," he said, his voice deep and smooth, "welcome to your new home." Emma forced a small smile, her throat tight. "Home," she thought bitterly, but she said nothing, simply nodding as she stepped into the room. David crossed the space between them and took her hand, his touch firm but cold. He raised it to his lips, brushing a kiss over her knuckles. "I know this must all be very overwhelming for you," he said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Emma's skin crawl. "But I promise you, you'll grow to love it here. You'll have everything you could ever want." Emma wanted to pull her hand away, but she forced herself to stay still, to let him hold her in his grasp. She had no choice now. This was the life that had been chosen for her. "You'll have your own room, of course," David continued, his tone casual, as if they were discussing something as trivial as a dinner reservation. "You'll want for nothing. Clothes, jewelry, travel, whatever you desire, it's yours." "Whatever you desire." The words felt hollow. What Emma truly desired, freedom, autonomy, a life of her own, was not something David could give her. She had been sold for his wealth, traded by her mother for a gilded cage. This mansion with all its grandeur wasn't a refuge, it was a prison wrapped in luxury. "I appreciate it," Emma managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel David's eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. David smiled, satisfied by her response, and gestured toward a grand staircase. "Let me show you to your room." Emma followed him silently, the grand surroundings pressing in on her. As they ascended the stairs, her mind wandered to the life she had just left behind. The small house, the constant fear of Greg's temper, her mother's distant, broken expression. She had thought she was escaping that life. But now, walking through this opulent mansion, she wasn't so sure. What kind of freedom had she really found? David led her to a large bedroom at the far end of the house. The room was beautiful. Plush carpets, floor-to-ceiling windows, a bed so large it could swallow her whole. But as Emma stood in the center of the room, taking in the lavish surroundings, she felt a deep sense of isolation. "You'll be very comfortable here," David said, stepping beside her. "Anything you need, just ask. This is your home now." Emma nodded again, her mouth dry. Home. The word felt more foreign each time it was spoken. David lingered for a moment, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her stomach twist. "I'll let you get settled," he said finally, turning to leave. "Dinner will be served at 8. I expect you to join me." As soon as the door closed behind him, Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. The room, despite its beauty, felt like a cage, one where the bars were invisible but no less real. She glanced out the window, where the perfectly manicured garden stretched out beneath the fading sky. Beyond the estate's walls, the world continued on, free and indifferent to her plight. But inside, she was trapped. David had bought her freedom with his wealth, but the price had been her soul, and now she was bound to him, locked in this gilded prison. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of it all settled on her. She had traded one form of captivity for another. David wasn't Greg. He didn't shout, didn't lash out in anger, but the control was the same. He owned her now, in ways that went deeper than she had ever anticipated. Emma curled up on the bed, her body trembling. The mansion around her, with all its grandeur, felt suffocating. She had been sold for freedom, but this was no freedom at all. This was the beginning of a new kind of Chapter 7. David's Demands. The days that followed Emma's arrival at David's estate were suffocatingly quiet. At first glance, everything seemed serene. The house was a haven of luxury, the staff polite and accommodating, and David was always composed, always polite. But beneath the polished veneer, there was something unsettling, something dark and deeply wrong about the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her, as if she were an object he had purchased rather than a person. Emma quickly learned that her days would follow a strict routine, one that David had carefully crafted. Every morning a maid would arrive to help her dress, guiding her through a wardrobe filled with expensive gowns and outfits. David expected her to join him for breakfast promptly at 8 a.m., and from there her day was meticulously planned. Piano lessons, language classes, walks around the garden, but always under someone's watchful eye. It was as if David was grooming her for something she couldn't yet understand. At first, Emma complied, trying to convince herself that this was her new life, that it was better than what she had left behind. After all, there were no screaming arguments, no violent outbursts like she had endured with Greg. Here, everything was controlled, orderly. But as the days stretched on, Emma began to feel like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, pampered but still very much a prisoner. One morning, after finishing breakfast, David folded his napkin neatly and looked at her with that same unnerving intensity he always had. His eyes never seemed to reflect warmth, only a cold, calculated interest. "Emma," he began, his voice smooth and calm, "there are certain expectations I have now that you are here." Her chest tightened at his words, and she set down her fork, suddenly unable to eat. "Expectations?" David leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled together. "You are my wife, or soon will be. And as my wife, you will need to behave in ways that reflect well on me. You must always present yourself with grace, with poise. You will attend social gatherings with me, entertain my business partners, and represent this household with the dignity it deserves. Emma's stomach twisted, a cold sense of dread creeping into her veins. What do you mean? David stood, walking slowly around the table until he was standing directly behind her chair. She could feel the weight of his presence before he even touched her, and when his hand finally rested on her shoulder, it felt like ice. He leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. "You belong to me now, Emma," he whispered, his voice low and possessive. "Everything you do, everything you are, is mine." Emma froze, her body